The final lurch of the stagecoach threw Eleanor Whitlow against the worn leather of the door. For a moment, she let her head rest there. The vibration of the wheels over hard-packed earth, a final, weary shudder through her bones. The air outside, once the coach stopped, went still and thick with a fine and red dust that coated everything. It was the dust of the Colorado Territory, a place she had only ever seen in the hopeful scrawl of a man named Samuel Morrison. His letters promised a new life built on a quarter section of land and the strength of 2 willing pairs of hands. Her hands were willing. They were chapped and tired, but they were ready. She pushed the door open, her worn boots sinking into a powder so fine it felt like sifted flour. The sun was a hammer in a bleached white sky. Dustwater was not so much a town as a scar on the land. A handful of raw timber buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, empty prairie that stretched to the jagged teeth of mountains in the distance. The wind had a mean streak, whipping grit into her eyes and tasting of nothing. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, her gaze sweeping over the saloon, the general store with its faded sign, and the blacksmith shop from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel rang out. A lonely, defiant heartbeat in the oppressive silence. Her only luggage was a small carpet bag, containing 2 dresses, a Bible, and the bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. She clutched the bag in one hand and in the other, a piece of paper with a crudely drawn map. According to Samuel, his plot was at the northern edge of town, marked by a lone cottonwood tree. Her heart, a nervous bird in her chest, beat a little faster. This was it. The end of a long journey from Ohio. The end of being a widow with no prospects. The beginning of being a wife with a home. The walk through town was a quiet gauntlet. Faces appeared in dusty windows, eyes lingering on her unfamiliar dress, her solitary figure. Men paused their conversations on the boardwalk, their gazes heavy with a kind of weary curiosity. No one smiled. No one offered a greeting. This was a place where people kept to themselves, their welcome as hard and unyielding as the land itself. Eleanor kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on the northern horizon. The sole of her left shoe had worn through, and with every other step, a small, sharp stone reminded her just how far from home she truly was. Her mouth was dry, the taste of alkaline dust coating her tongue. She found the cottonwood tree. It stood stooped and weary, its leaves rustling with a dry, papery sound. And beside it, where a cabin and a life were supposed to be, there was nothing but a patch of stubborn weeds, a few scattered stones, and the endless, indifferent dirt. Eleanor walked the perimeter of the supposed plot, her map trembling in her hand. She checked the landmarks Samuel had described, the dip in the land to the east, the flat-topped mesa to the west. This was the place, but the man and the home he had promised were gone. It was as if he had been a ghost, his letters the only proof he had ever existed at all. A hollow space opened up inside her, vast and cold as the landscape. She did not cry. The tears felt baked dry inside her skull. She simply stood there, a lone woman next to a lone tree, the promises in her pocket now feeling like nothing more than a cruel joke. The dream of a new life had evaporated into the thin, dry air. She eventually found her way to the boarding house, a 2-story building that leaned slightly to the left. The woman at the desk, Mrs. Gable, had a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. Eleanor paid for a room for one night, the coin feeling heavy and final in her palm. She did not explain her circumstances. She did not have the words, and she could tell from the woman's tight-lipped expression that pity was not a commodity traded here. Later, sitting in the common room nursing a cup of weak, bitter tea, she listened to the low murmur of conversation from a group of men by the cold stove. They were not talking about land claims or the price of feed. They were talking about someone they called Ash. The name was spoken in hushed, fearful tones. A wild man, they said, who lived up in the mountains like an animal. One man, a freighter with a grizzled beard, claimed the man had killed a prospector, Tom Garrett, and left nothing but gnawed bones behind. Another added that he had seen him once, at a distance, a tall, silent shape moving through the trees, his eyes glowing in the dusk like a wolf's. The stories were fragmented, each man adding a new layer of grotesque detail. They said he was a deserter from the army, a madman who had lost his family and his mind in the same fire. They whispered that he consorted with the Ute, that he was more savage than any native. Eleanor listened, the tea growing cold in her hands. The talk was meant to scare, to draw a line between the town and the wilderness, between civilized folk and the monsters that lurked just beyond their sight. Yet, something in the telling felt wrong. It was too easy, too neat. The fear was real, but it felt practiced. A story told so many times it had taken on a life of its own, separate from whatever truth might have birthed it. The next morning, driven by a need to do something, anything other than sit in her small, airless room, Eleanor walked to the edge of town. She needed supplies, but more than that, she needed to feel the ground under her feet, to remind herself that she was still solid, still real, even if her future was not. Near the creek that trickled past the last of the town's shacks, she saw a man. He was not one of the townsfolk. He was tall and lean, his skin the color of rich earth, his long black hair bound with a leather tie. He stood with a quiet, rooted stillness that seemed to make the bustling anxiety of dust water fade into the background. He was trading with a trapper, a small pouch of tobacco for a block of salt. As the trapper left, the native man's eyes met Eleanor's. They were dark and intelligent, and they held no judgment, only a deep, assessing calm. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Eleanor, feeling a strange pull of kinship with this other outsider, nodded back. She watched him for a moment longer as he prepared to leave, securing the salt in a deerskin pouch. He moved with an economy of motion, a grace that spoke of a life lived in harmony with the harshness of the land, not in opposition to it. As he turned to walk toward the mountains, he paused and looked at her one last time. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, his English simple and direct. "The West tests a person's heart," he said. The words hung in the air long after he had disappeared into the scrub and pine. They were not a threat, nor a warning. They were a statement of fact, as plain and true as the sun in the sky. And in that moment, Eleanor knew she could not leave. Not yet. To turn back now would be to admit her heart had failed the test before it had even truly begun. The anger she felt toward Samuel Morrison was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a different feeling was taking root, a stubborn refusal to be broken, a flicker of something that felt like justice. She did not know what she would do, or how she would survive, but she would not run. She would stand her ground, on this empty plot of land that was supposed to be her life, and she would face whatever came next. She walked back toward the center of town, her steps more certain now. The desolation of the morning had been replaced by a quiet, simmering resolve. She would find the sheriff, ask questions about Samuel Morrison. She would not let his deceit be the final word. As she reached the main square, a sudden commotion erupted from the direction of the saloon. Voices were raised, not in drunken revelry, but in a sharp, ugly clamor. Men spilled out onto the boardwalk, their faces flushed with a kind of righteous fury. The blacksmith left his forge, his hammer still in his hand. "Mrs." Gable appeared in the doorway of the boarding house, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mask of grim anticipation. The crowd swelled, a single organism moving with a shared, menacing purpose. Then a voice, raw and powerful, cut through the noise, a command that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine and stopped her dead in her tracks. "Bring out the cage." The cage was a crude affair of iron bars and raw timber, dragged into the center of the square on squealing wagon wheels. It was 8 feet square, a box built for a beast, and the midday sun beat down upon it, making the metal shimmer with a heat that warped the air. The crowd pressed in, a sweaty, murmuring mass of ranchers, storekeeps, and dusty children whose parents did not bother to shield their eyes. They smelled of whiskey and righteous anger. Eleanor stood apart, near the water trough, the damp wood cool against her back. She was an island of stillness in their agitated sea. Inside the cage sat the man they called Ash. His real name, the sheriff had announced, was Jacob Stone. He was not the hulking, slavering monster from the tavern stories. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders and long of limb, but he was folded into the cage's confines with a kind of weary resignation. His hair was a dark, tangled mane, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But his eyes were clear and steady. They were fixed on some point far beyond the jeering faces, beyond the buildings of Dustwater, out toward the silent, blue mountains. His hands, cuffed at the wrist with a length of chain between them, rested on his knees. They were the hands of a maker, calloused and scarred. Not a destroyer. Eleanor saw it instantly. This was not the silence of a wild animal waiting to strike. It was the profound quiet of a man who had been hurt so badly that he had learned the only safety was in utter stillness, in making himself seem as harmless as a stone. Sheriff Blake Caro, a man whose silver star seemed too heavy for his chest, stood beside the cage, holding a shotgun that he looked uncomfortable with. He raised a hand for quiet, though his voice was nearly lost in the din. "Now, listen here. I have him locked up safe. We will hold him until Judge O'Rourke gets here on his circuit. He will have a proper trial." A roar of dissent rose from the crowd. A man named Marcus Garrett, whose brother Tom was the supposed victim, pushed his way to the front. His face was a thundercloud of grief and vengeance. "A trial? For that animal? He killed my brother, Caro, left him for the coyotes. We are the only justice Tom is going to get. Hang him now." The cry was taken up by others. "Hang him now!" The sound was a physical thing, a wave of hate that washed over the square. The sheriff took a nervous step back, his authority crumbling like a dry dirt clod. He was a man who followed the path of least resistance, and the path was leading directly to the nearest sturdy tree. Eleanor felt the blood pound in her temples. The injustice of it was a bitter taste in her mouth, sharp and familiar. First Samuel Morrison's phantom promises. Now this, a man was about to be murdered by a story. She did not think, she acted. She pushed away from the trough, her worn boots making no sound in the thick dust, and walked into the space that separated the crowd from the cage. Every eye turned to her. The shouting died into a confused murmur. Who was this woman, with her plain traveling dress and the determined set of her jaw? "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. "What proof do you have that he committed this crime?" Sheriff Caro blinked, taken aback. "Ma'am, this is not your concern." Marcus Garrett stepped toward her, his eyes blazing. "Proof. Everyone knows what he is, a savage who lives in a cave. We found Tom's bones not half a mile from there. What more proof do you need?" "Bones?" Eleanor countered, her gaze unwavering. "You found bones. Did you see this man do it? Did anyone? Or are you planning to kill him based on tavern gossip and a pile of old bones that could belong to anyone?" A woman in the crowd shouted, "She is defending him!" Marcus Garrett pointed a trembling finger at her. "You have no place here. Go back to wherever you came from before you find trouble you cannot handle." Eleanor's own loss, her own betrayal, had burned away any fear she might have felt. She had nothing left to lose. What she had was a spine forged in grief and disappointment, and it would not bend to them. She turned her back on Marcus and the sheriff, and for the first time, she looked directly at the man in the cage. His gaze had shifted. He was looking at her now, a flicker of something, confusion or perhaps surprise, in their depths. She saw the whole scene with a terrible clarity. The mob was a hungry beast, and the sheriff was too weak to chain it. Words were not enough. Reason was not enough. They needed a spectacle. And if they could not have a hanging, they would have nothing. An idea, desperate and insane, bloomed in her mind. It was a gamble against death itself, played with the only token she had left. Her hand went to the small reticule at her waist. Her fingers closed around the thin, worn gold band that had been her husband's wedding ring. It had been too small for his finger, a cheap purchase from a traveling peddler, but he had worn it on a leather cord around his neck. She had kept it for sentiment. Now, it would be her weapon. She walked the final few steps to the cage, the dust muffling her footfalls. The crowd was utterly silent, watching her, holding its collective breath. She stopped just before the bars, so close she could feel the heat radiating from the iron. She held up the small, simple ring between her thumb and forefinger, the gold catching a glint of the merciless sun. She looked into Jacob Stone's eyes. She did not know his story. She did not know if he was innocent. She only knew that what was happening was wrong, and she was the only one standing in its way. "Please marry me," she said, her voice not much more than a whisper. Yet it carried across the silent square like a gunshot. For a long moment, no one moved. The world seemed to stop. The man in the cage stared at her, his expression unreadable. The crowd was a gallery of stunned faces. Then, a low chuckle started, growing into a wave of derisive laughter. "The crazy woman wants to marry the monster." But before the laughter could fully take hold, the sound of an approaching buggy cut through the air. An old man with a cloud of white hair and a weary but authoritative face pulled the horse to a halt. The silver star pinned to his coat was tarnished, but it was larger than the sheriff's. "What in God's name is going on here?" "Caro," the old man boomed, his voice accustomed to commanding courtrooms. "I leave for 3 months and you turn the town square into a circus." "Judge O'Rourke," the sheriff stammered, his face a mixture of relief and dread. We caught Tom Garrett's killer." The judge surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes taking in the cage, the prisoner, the mob, and finally, the woman standing before them with a ring held aloft. His gaze lingered on her, and a hint of understanding dawned on his tired features. He swung himself down from the buggy with the stiffness of old age. He walked toward Eleanor, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. "Did I hear you correctly, ma'am?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Did you just propose marriage to this man?" "Yes, Your Honor." "I did," Eleanor said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And you, son," the judge said, turning to the man in the cage. "Do you accept this woman's proposal?" Jacob Stone's gaze shifted from the judge back to Eleanor. He looked at her, truly looked at her. For a long, silent moment, he saw the desperation in her eyes, but also the steel. He saw the absurd, impossible chance she was offering. Very slowly, deliberately, he gave a single, solid nod. The judge turned to the sputtering sheriff. "Well, Caro, it seems we have a legal matter to attend to that takes precedence over your mob's entertainment. As a justice of the peace for this territory, I am empowered to officiate a civil union. Unlock the cage." "But, Judge," Marcus Garrett started, stepping forward. But nothing. "Mr. Garrett," the judge snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "This man is a prisoner of the law, not yours, and by law, he is entitled to marry. Unless you want to be held in contempt of my authority, you will be silent." The sheriff, fumbling with his keys, opened the heavy iron door. It groaned in protest. Judge O'Rourke stood before them, the crowd a frustrated, muttering wall around them. "Do you, Eleanor Whitlow, take this man, Jacob Stone, to be your lawful husband?" "I do," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "And do you, Jacob Stone," the judge said, peering through the bars, "take this woman, Eleanor Whitlow, to be your lawful wife?" Again, the man only nodded. "Then, by the power vested in me by the Colorado Territory, I pronounce you man and wife," the judge declared. He then turned to the sheriff. "Your prisoner now has a wife, a citizen with rights. You will release him into her custody, and you will see that they are clear of this town's limits by sundown. They are not to return. Is that understood?" Sheriff Caro simply nodded, dumbly. He undid the chains from the cage floor, but left the cuffs on Jacob's wrists. The crowd's shock had curdled back into a low, simmering rage. They had been cheated. As Jacob stepped out of the cage, blinking in the direct sun, the insults began. Curses and vile names were thrown at them, at the silent man and the woman who had claimed him. A clod of dirt struck Eleanor's shoulder. She flinched but did not cry out. Jacob shifted his body slightly, placing himself between her and the most aggressive part of the crowd. He still had not spoken a word. Together, they walked. They walked past the saloon, past the general store, past the leering, hateful faces. They did not look back. They walked out of Dustwater, following the dusty track that led nowhere. The sun began its long, slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. When they finally passed the crooked wooden sign that marked the town's edge, they were alone. Two strangers, bound by a desperate vow. A man still in chains, and a woman who had just gambled her life on a ghost of a chance. The vast, empty wilderness stretched out before them, a future as unknown and menacing as the coming night. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a deep purple bruise on the horizon. A cold wind began to snake its way down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a bitter night. They had walked for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the simmering pot of dust water. Jacob Stone had not spoken, not once. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride, the chain between his wrists making a soft, rhythmic clinking that was the only sound besides the wind and the crunch of their boots on the gravelly soil. Eleanor followed, her body aching with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. She watched his back, the broad set of his shoulders, the way he scanned the landscape with a constant, practiced alertness. He was looking for something. Finally. As the last light faded, he turned off the main track and led her into a shallow draw, where a cluster of gnarled juniper bushes offered a meager shield against the wind. It was not a home, but it was a place to stop. Without a word, he began to prepare a camp, while Eleanor sank onto a flat rock, pulling her thin shawl tighter. He gathered dry twigs and fallen branches. His movements were hampered by the cuffs, yet he worked with a fluid efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He cleared a small patch of ground, ringed it with stones, and then, taking two small, flinty rocks from his pocket, he began to strike them together. The chain clinked with each precise motion. A spark caught in the tinder he had arranged, smoldered, and with a gentle breath from him, bloomed into a tiny, fragile flame. Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The fire was more than just warmth. It was a small point of light and life in the vast, gathering dark. It was a circle of safety. She pulled a needle and thread from her bag and began to mend a tear in the sleeve of her dress, her hands moving automatically. It was a small, familiar task, a way to anchor herself in the terrifying uncertainty of her new reality. The fire grew, casting a flickering, golden light on their small camp. In its glow, Eleanor could see Jacob's hands more clearly as he fed sticks to the flames. They were remarkable hands, large and powerful, with a web of fine white scars crisscrossing the knuckles and a deep, ingrained blackness around the nails and in the calluses that could only come from years of working a forge. The stories had called him a savage, a wild man. But these were the hands of a creator, a man who shaped hard things for a living. He noticed her gaze, and for a moment, his hands went still. Then, his eyes fell upon the carpet bag at her feet. One of the leather straps had frayed, its stitching coming undone from the long journey. He gestured toward it with his cuffed hands. A silent question. Eleanor hesitated for a second, then pushed the bag toward him. He picked it up, his touch surprisingly gentle. From another pocket, he produced a small roll of sinew and a wicked-looking awl. holding the leather strap steady with one hand. He deftly punched new holes with the awl, then began restitching the strap with the tough sinew, his large fingers moving with a surgeon's precision despite the cumbersome iron on his wrists. He worked in complete silence, his focus absolute. When he was finished, the strap was stronger than it had been before. He pushed the bag back to her. The simple, practical act of kindness was more eloquent than any words he could have spoken. It was an offering of peace, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared predicament. Just as she was murmuring a quiet thank you, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beyond the firelight. Neither of them had heard a sound, but suddenly, a man was there. It was the Ute warrior Eleanor had seen by the creek. He stood at the edge of the fire's glow, his presence calm and commanding. He was not a threat, but a fact, like a boulder or a tree. His dark eyes took in the scene, resting for a long moment on the iron cuffs that still bound Jacob's hands. He looked at Jacob, and there was a deep, shared history in his gaze. He spoke, his voice low and guttural, his English direct. "That brother has already paid with blood." He offered no more explanation. He simply gave a slight nod, a gesture that encompassed both Eleanor and Jacob, then melted back into the night as silently as he had appeared, leaving behind the weight of his cryptic words. Paid with blood. The phrase echoed in Eleanor's mind, adding another layer of mystery to the silent man who was now her husband. The temperature continued to drop, and the desert cold seeped into their bones. Eleanor shivered, her shawl offering little protection. Jacob noticed. He looked at her, then at the single, thin woolen blanket she had laid out beside her bag. He rose and walked to the other side of the fire, putting his back against a large rock, as if to cede the entire space and the blanket to her. "It is big enough for two," Eleanor said, her voice small against the sighing of the wind. She immediately felt foolish, her words sounding forward and strange. He did not look at her, but after a long moment, he rose and came back to her side of the fire. He sat down a careful distance away, the space between them charged with a nervous energy. Eleanor unfolded the blanket. It was a threadbare thing, but it was all they had. She held one side out to him, hesitantly. He took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The touch was like a spark, a brief, surprising jolt of warmth and human connection. They sat huddled under the shared covering, not speaking, listening to the crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of a distant coyote. The proximity was both a comfort and a trial. A deep awareness of the stranger beside her, his scent of wood smoke and sweat, the solid presence of his shoulder near hers. Sleep felt impossible, yet eventually, lulled by the fire's warmth and a bone-deep exhaustion. Eleanor's head grew heavy, and she drifted into a restless, dreamless slumber. She awoke with the first gray light of dawn. The fire was a pile of glowing embers, and a fine layer of frost covered the ground. Jacob was already awake. He was not by the fire. He was 20 yards away, by a rocky outcrop, and he was working. He had found a slab of granite with a sharp, unforgiving edge, with a terrible, patient resolve. He was grinding the thick rivet of his iron cuffs against the stone. Eleanor got up and walked toward him, the blanket clutched around her shoulders. The sound was a harsh, grating scrape of metal on rock, a sound that set her teeth on edge. She saw that he had been at it for some time. The iron was scored and hot, and his hands were raw and bleeding, the skin torn away by the relentless friction. Yet his face was a mask of concentration, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the single point of his labor. He was a man determined to unmake his own prison, one painful scrape at a time. She stood watching, her heart aching for him. This was not the act of a wild animal, but of a man with an iron will, a man desperate to be free, without thinking. She turned and went back to her bag, taking out her last clean petticoat. She tore a long strip from the hem. When she returned to his side, he did not stop, but he watched her from the corner of his eye. "Let me," she said softly. He finally paused, his chest heaving with exertion. He held out his bleeding hands. Eleanor gently wrapped the soft cloth around his raw palms, creating a padded grip for him to continue his work. Her touch was light, her movements careful. He did not pull away. He allowed her this small intimacy, this act of care, in that quiet moment. As she tied the final knot, a fragile thread of trust was spun between them. He gave her a single, grateful look, then turned back to his task. The sun was fully above the horizon when it happened. With a final, ear-splitting shriek of tortured metal, the rivet gave way. The heavy iron cuffs fell apart, clattering onto the rocks below with a sound of absolute finality. Jacob stumbled back, his hands free for the first time since he had been captured. He stood there, staring at his wrists, at the raw, chafed skin where the iron had been. He flexed his fingers slowly, as if reacquainting himself with them. A single, ragged breath escaped his lips. Eleanor saw the sheen of moisture in his eyes before he quickly looked away, toward the vast, open sky. He did not celebrate. The moment was too heavy, too profound for that. It was a resurrection. Then, a sudden, focused anger transformed his features. He bent down and picked up the two halves of the broken shackle. He walked to the edge of the draw, where the land fell away into a shallow, rocky ravine, with a guttural cry that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. He raised the pieces of iron high above his head and smashed them against a large boulder. Again and again. The clang of iron on stone echoed in the crisp morning air, a violent, percussive declaration of freedom. He did not stop until the metal was bent and twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Then he threw the mangled pieces into the ravine, where they disappeared among the rocks. He stood there for a long time, his back to her, his shoulders shaking. A man finally released from a cage that was more than just iron bars. With the mangled iron of his bondage left behind in the ravine, a profound shift occurred. The silence that had clung to Jacob Stone like a shroud remained. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It was not the stillness of a caged animal, but the focused silence of a man with a purpose. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a guide. He scanned the horizon. His eyes narrowed against the morning sun, and then, with a brief, decisive gesture, he pointed them toward a gap in the foothills, a gateway to the high country. He started walking, and Eleanor followed without question. They traveled for the rest of the day, moving upward, away from the flat, exposed prairie and into a world of rising rock and whispering pine. The air grew cooler, cleaner. Jacob moved with a tireless, long-limbed grace, finding paths that were barely visible, his feet seeming to know the land in a way that went beyond mere sight. He showed Eleanor how to find water, a seep of moisture at the base of a north-facing cliff. He found a handful of wild onions, their sharp, clean taste a welcome relief from the stale biscuit she had been rationing. He was a part of this wilderness. And for the first time since arriving in this harsh territory, Eleanor felt a flicker not of fear, but of profound wonder. Late in the afternoon, they emerged from a narrow canyon into a small, hidden valley. It was a place of impossible beauty and profound peace, a narrow creek, its water so cold it made their teeth ache, tumbled over smooth stones down the center, on either side. The land rose in gentle, grassy terraces, evidence of some long-ago effort to tame the wild soil. The valley was cupped in the hand of tall, granite peaks, their jagged edges seeming to bite at the deep, cloudless blue of the sky. It felt secret. It felt safe. As they walked deeper into the valley, they came upon it. Tucked against the base of the western slope was the ruin of a dream. It was a dugout, a rectangular pit scraped from the earth, with the beginnings of a low stone wall lining one side. A pile of weathered timber lay nearby, silvered by the sun and wind. This was it, the place from Samuel Morrison's letters, the lie that had brought her here. Yet, standing in the quiet valley, looking at the abandoned foundation. Eleanor felt no anger, only a strange sense of destiny. The hollow promise had led her to a solid truth. This place was real. Jacob stopped beside the pit, his gaze sweeping over the site, his mind already working. Eleanor watched him, seeing not the prisoner from Dustwater, but a master craftsman assessing a project. He began to pace the perimeter of the dugout, his long strides a natural unit of measurement. He kicked at the loose soil, tested the stability of the half-built wall with his hands. Then he picked up a long, straight stick and began to scratch a design into the bare earth. It was not a crude sketch, it was a plan, precise and clear. He drew the outline of a small, sturdy cabin, adding a rectangle for a hearth at one end and a square for a window at the other, facing east to catch the morning sun. He looked up at her, his eyes questioning, seeking her approval. Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. He was not assuming. He was asking. He was inviting her to be a part of this, to build this with him. She nodded, unable to speak, and a look of quiet satisfaction settled on his face. This was his language, the language of building, of making, and she was beginning to understand it perfectly. They began work immediately, a silent partnership falling into a natural rhythm. Eleanor cleared the pit of weeds and loose rocks, her hands growing sore but her spirit feeling lighter with every stone she moved. Jacob, with his immense strength, began to haul larger rocks from the creek bed to continue the foundation wall. He worked with a relentless, focused energy, each movement economical and purposeful. They were not just building a shelter, they were building a new reality, a place where the past could not reach them. As the sun began to dip toward the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the valley floor, they stopped to rest by the creek. The day's labor had left them both tired, but it was a good, clean exhaustion. Jacob sat on a large, flat rock, staring into the gurgling water. The fire of his earlier anger had banked, leaving behind a deep, settled sorrow in his eyes. He picked up a handful of small, pale pebbles from the stream bed. For a long moment, he just held them, their smoothness a contrast to his calloused skin. Then, on the flat surface of the rock, he began to arrange them. He set 3 pebbles close together in a tight little cluster. Then, a small distance away, he placed a single, smaller stone by itself. He looked at Eleanor, his face etched with a pain so profound it was difficult to look at. He pointed to the cluster of 3. He tapped the largest stone, then tapped his own chest. He pointed to the one beside it, his hand making a gentle, curving motion in the air, the universal sign for a woman. Then he pointed to the smallest pebble, holding his hand low to the ground, indicating the height of a small child, a family. His gaze then moved to the single, isolated stone. He drew a small mound over it in the dirt with his finger. A grave, his wife. Then his hands began to speak a terrible, silent story. He made a galloping motion with his fingers, the sign for horses. He made a shape like a gun, his hand recoiling from an imaginary shot. He swept his arm in a wide, violent arc. Raiders. His expression was a mask of remembered horror, his eyes seeing a scene only he could see. He looked back at the pebble that represented his child, and with a gesture of infinite tenderness and finality, he gently pushed it over to join the single stone representing its mother. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could be. The rumors, the tavern gossip, it all fell away, replaced by a devastating and simple truth. He had not been the monster in that story. He had been the one who survived it. Eleanor did not ask questions. There were no questions to ask. His silent confession was complete, a story told in stones and gestures that had torn a hole in the quiet evening. She reached out, not to touch him, but to the small, stony effigies of his lost family. She gently pushed the largest pebble, the one that was him, over to join the others. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "We will build slowly," she said, her voice thick but steady. but we will build strong." He looked at her, and in his eyes was a gratitude so deep it was bottomless. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He understood. She was not just offering to help him build a house. She was offering to help him build a life. That night, as they sat by the fire, the chill of the high country air settling around them, Jacob took a piece of charcoal from the edge of the fire pit. He found a flat, smooth piece of scrap lumber from the pile Morrison had left behind. Eleanor watched, expecting him to refine the plans for the cabin. Instead, he began to draw her. His rough, calloused hands moved with a surprising delicacy, the charcoal whispering across the wood. He was not a trained artist, but he had a true eye. He captured the line of her jaw, the weariness in her eyes, but also the stubborn strength that held her upright. He drew her looking not at him, not at the fire, but out into the darkness, toward the east, toward the rising sun. He was drawing her hope. When he was finished, he held it out to her. The simple charcoal sketch was the most beautiful gift she had ever received. It was a reflection of how he saw her, not as a helpless widow or a desperate woman, but as a partner, a survivor looking toward the dawn. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, a comfortable quiet settled between them. The awkwardness of their first night together was gone, replaced by the easy familiarity of shared labor and shared sorrow. Eleanor felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She reached across the small space between them and gently brushed a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead. It was an impulsive gesture, an act of simple, human tenderness. He went completely still at her touch, his head bowed. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. He did not try to kiss her lips. Instead, he pressed a soft, hesitant kiss to her forehead. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, a silent promise. It was chaste and fleeting, yet it was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. He cleared his throat, his mouth working as if to form a word he had not spoken in years. The sound, when it came, was rough and low, a voice rusty from disuse, a question that held the weight of everything they had been through and everything that was to come. Home. Eleanor looked from his earnest face to the dark outline of their half-built shelter, then back to him. A real smile, the first one in a very long time, touched her lips. "Home," she answered, her voice full of a certainty that warmed her to her very soul. The walls of the cabin were up, a sturdy skeleton of notched logs that now defined their space in the world. They had a roof of packed earth and pine boughs, and a hearth of river stones that drew smoke better than Eleanor could have hoped. But it was an empty shell. They needed the things that would turn it from a shelter into a home: nails to lay a proper floor, a bolt for the door, canvas to cover the window frame against the coming winter, a real pot to cook in. These were things their valley could not provide. They could only be bought in Cedar Falls, a trading post a full day's ride to the north, a place with a reputation for being rougher and less judgmental than Dustwater. They set out at dawn, walking side by side, leading a stubborn old mule Jacob had managed to catch and gentle. The air was crisp, and the silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a comfortable, unspoken understanding. The shared labor of building had woven them together in a way words never could. They were a team. The path led them out of their sheltered valley and down through a series of winding canyons. The landscape grew harsher, the gentle slopes replaced by towering walls of red and orange rock that pressed in on either side. The air grew still and close, the sound of their own footsteps and the mule's clopping hooves echoing unnaturally in the narrow space. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. Out here, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The canyon was a natural trap. They had just rounded a sharp bend, the walls so close they could touch them on either side, when they saw them, 3 riders, blocking the path ahead. They sat their horses like stone statues, rifles held loosely across their saddles. The man in the middle was Marcus Garrett. Eleanor's blood went cold. She stopped so abruptly that the mule bumped into her back. Jacob put a hand on her arm, a steadying pressure, and stepped slightly in front of her. His face was a calm, unreadable mask. But Eleanor saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. His hand drifted down, resting near the hilt of the large skinning knife tucked into his belt. It was their only weapon against 3 rifles. "Well, look what we have here, Dale," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous drawl that scraped against the canyon's silence. "It is the animal and his little town pet." The man named Dale, thin and weasel-faced, grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. "I told you they would have to come down from the mountain sometime. Marcus." "What do you want?" "Garrett," Jacob said. His voice, still rough from disuse, was flat and even, betraying no fear. "What do I want?" Marcus repeated, a note of disbelief in his voice. He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. He was a big man, his grief and anger making him seem even larger. "I want justice for my brother. I want to see you swing from a tree. The judge and your little woman there cheated me of that, but there is no judge out here." He took a step forward, raising his rifle. The third man, a heavy-set fellow named Kirby, cocked his own rifle. The sound, a sharp, metallic click, was deafening in the enclosed space. The situation was impossibly stark. They were trapped, outmatched, and minutes away from death. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She looked at Jacob, expecting to see him draw his knife, to make a desperate, final stand. But he did not. Instead, he did the most unexpected, the most insane thing she could have imagined. He let go of her arm, took one step forward into the open space between them, and slowly, deliberately, he sank to his knees in the dust. The move was so shocking it broke the tension. Marcus Garrett stopped, his rifle held halfway up, a look of pure confusion on his face. Dale and Kirby exchanged a bewildered glance. It was an act of complete and utter surrender, a gesture so at odds with the legend of the Savage Ash that it made no sense. Jacob ignored their confusion. He reached up and pulled a leather cord from around his neck. Dangling from it was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. He held it in his palm for a moment, a silent communion with a memory. Then he let it fall back against his chest. With one hand, he began to draw in the fine dust of the canyon floor. His finger moved with a steady, certain purpose. He drew 2 stick figures, facing each other. He drew a line from the hand of one figure, representing a weapon. Then, he drew the second figure falling backward to the ground. It was a stark, simple depiction of a fatal encounter, a fight, a death. Marcus watched, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "That is right," he snarled, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You admit it. You killed him." Jacob did not look up. His drawing was not finished. He moved his finger back to the figure that remained standing, the one that was him. With a gesture of profound and heartbreaking sorrow, he drew its hand coming up to cover its eyes. He was not drawing a killer celebrating his victory. He was drawing a man shielding himself from a sight too terrible to bear. He was drawing grief. He was asking for forgiveness for an act of self-defense that had shattered his own world as surely as it had ended another's. The canyon was utterly silent. The only sound was the wind, a low moan through the high rocks. Marcus Garrett stared at the drawing in the dust, then at the kneeling man, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt entered his eyes. He was seeing not a monster, but a man in pain. Dale, the weasel-faced man, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "You know, Marcus," he said, his voice quiet and hesitant. "Tom, he was always quick to draw when he was in his cups, and he was drinking heavy that day. Said he was going up the mountain to prove how brave he was." "Shut up, Dale," Marcus snapped. But the words had hit their mark. A seed of uncertainty had been planted. The simple story of a monstrous killer and an innocent victim was beginning to unravel. The drawing in the dust told a different story, a more complicated, more tragic one, and Dale's words gave it the ring of truth. Marcus stood there for a long time, his rifle still in his hands, the war for his own soul playing out across his face. The desire for vengeance was a powerful fire, but Jacob's shocking vulnerability had thrown water on the flames. To shoot a kneeling, unarmed man who was begging not for his life but for understanding, it was not justice. It was something else entirely, something uglier. Finally, with a curse, he lowered the rifle. He looked at Jacob, his eyes filled with a raw, confused anger. "Get up," he said, his voice thick. Jacob slowly rose to his feet, dust clinging to the knees of his trousers. He did not look triumphant. He looked exhausted. "I do not know what happened up on that mountain," Marcus said, his voice ragged. "And right now, I do not care, but I am giving you one warning. Stay out of my sight. Stay away from my home. Away from this valley. If I see you again, I will not hesitate. Do you understand?" Jacob gave a single, slow nod. Marcus stared at him for another long moment, then turned without another word, swung himself into his saddle, and galloped away, his two men following close behind. The sound of their hoofbeats echoed down the canyon and then faded, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more profound than before. Eleanor let out a breath she had not known she was holding, her legs trembling so badly she thought she would fall. Jacob turned to her, his face pale and drawn. He reached out and took her hand, his own hand cold but steady. They stood there for a minute, hands clasped, in the middle of the silent, empty canyon. They had walked into the jaws of death, and they had walked out again. They did not need to speak. In that shared, silent moment, they both understood. This was the second time they had survived together. Their bond, forged in a dusty town square and tempered in the wilderness, had just been hammered into something as strong and enduring as the rock that surrounded them. The journey to Cedar Falls was a pilgrimage born of necessity. The trail out of the high canyon opened onto a wider, more forgiving landscape, and as they walked, the oppressive memory of Marcus Garrett's rifle slowly receded, replaced by the practical concerns of their mission. They needed to turn their shell of a cabin into a fortress against the coming winter, and that required the tools and goods of civilization. Cedar Falls announced itself first by sound, a low, constant rumble that grew into the roar of a powerful waterfall cascading over a granite cliffside at the edge of the settlement. The town itself was larger and more alive than Dustwater. It was a working town, built around a sawmill and the freight line, its streets wider and rutted with the tracks of heavy wagons. There was a sense of purpose here, of people too busy with their own lives to spend much time inventing stories about strangers. Still, as they led the mule down the main street, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of curious eyes. Jacob's size and his long, wild hair drew attention, and whispers followed them like a trail of dust. Henderson's mercantile was a cavern of wonders, smelling of coffee beans, new leather, and oiled canvas. Shelves overflowed with everything from cast iron skillets to bolts of calico. The proprietor, Mr. Henderson, was a shrewd, hawk-nosed man who watched them from behind the counter, his eyes missing nothing. Eleanor approached with her list, acutely aware of Jacob standing silently behind her, a towering, intimidating presence. "We need nails," she began, her voice steady, "and a roll of canvas, 20 pounds of flour, salt, and a cooking pot." Henderson's gaze flickered from her to Jacob, then back again. His expression was neutral, but guarded. "Cash or credit?" "Cash," Eleanor replied, placing a small stack of coins on the worn wooden counter. It was almost everything she had left in the world. As Henderson began to measure out the flour, an old man leaning on a warped hickory cane hobbled into the store. He grumbled to himself, his voice a reedy complaint. "This blasted stick, good for nothing but leaning." going to snap in two one of these days. He held up the cane, showing where the wood had split near the handle. Jacob, who had been standing as still as a statue, took a single step forward. He did not speak, but he held out his hand toward the old man. The man, surprised, hesitated for a moment, then relinquished the broken cane. Jacob turned it over in his large, scarred hands. His touch was diagnostic, his fingers probing the split, testing the strength of the remaining wood. He caught Henderson's eye and gave a slight nod toward a spool of fine steel wire on the counter. Henderson, intrigued, nodded back. In a few moments of swift, efficient work, Jacob transformed the useless object. He used his knife to carve a shallow groove around the split, then tightly wrapped the steel wire into the groove, creating a binding that was both immensely strong and unobtrusive. He worked the ends of the wire into the wood so there were no sharp edges. When he was done, he tested the cane's strength against the floor. Putting his considerable weight on it, it held firm. He handed it back to the old man. The man stared at the repair, his jaw slack with amazement. He leaned on it, walked a few steps, and a slow grin spread across his wrinkled face. "Well, I will be, stronger than it ever was." "Thank you, son, thank you." The few other customers in the store had stopped to watch. Their hushed whispers were not of fear now, but of admiration. Henderson's guarded expression softened into one of grudging respect. This was not the work of some wild man. This was the work of a craftsman. Just as Eleanor finished paying, a sudden shout from the street outside was followed by a splintering crash and the terrified screaming of horses. Everyone rushed to the door. A massive freight wagon, overloaded with sacks and barrels, had lost a wheel and overturned in the middle of the street, shedding its cargo in a chaotic mess. The driver had been thrown clear, but a young boy lay pinned beneath the heavy, tilted wagon bed, his leg trapped at an unnatural angle. A crowd gathered instantly, a useless, panicked mob. Men shouted advice, women screamed, but no one knew what to do. The wagon was too heavy, its position too precarious. Then Jacob moved. He did not run. He strode into the center of the chaos, his presence so commanding that the shouting around him seemed to die down. He took in the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance, his mind instantly calculating angles and stress points. He pointed a long, authoritative finger at a stack of heavy timber beams outside the sawmill. Then he pointed at four of the biggest, strongest-looking men in the crowd. He did not need words. His meaning was perfectly clear. As the men scrambled to fetch a beam, Jacob was already organizing others. With a series of sharp, decisive hand gestures, he directed one group to calm the panicked horses and another to start clearing the debris from around the trapped boy. He moved with the calm authority of a general on a battlefield, and the panicked crowd, desperate for leadership, transformed into an effective and organized rescue party. Eleanor rushed to the boy's side, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. She pushed away a heavy sack of flour that was pressing on his chest, clearing his airway. She could see Jacob directing the placement of the heavy beam, positioning it as a lever. On his silent command, the 4 men he had chosen, plus 2 others who had joined them, put their shoulders to the beam and heaved. The massive wagon groaned, shifted, and slowly, inch by inch, lifted just enough. 2 other men, directed by Jacob's pointing finger, darted in and pulled the boy free. The moment the boy was clear, the crowd erupted in a ragged cheer. The boy's father, the wagon driver, rushed forward, sobbing with relief. Jacob knelt beside the boy, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the injured leg. It was broken, but the boy was alive. It was into this scene of grateful chaos that Marcus Garrett rode. He reined in his horse at the edge of the crowd, his face a mixture of surprise and disbelief. He saw the overturned wagon, the relieved driver, and at the center of it all, the man he had left for dead in a canyon, now being hailed as a hero. He dismounted and walked closer, not with aggression, but with a deep, searching curiosity. He watched as Jacob helped splint the boy's leg with 2 pieces of a broken crate and strips of cloth torn from a woman's apron. He did not approach Jacob directly. Instead, he stopped beside Mr. Henderson, who was watching from the boardwalk. "I heard a story once," Marcus said, his voice low, meant for Henderson but loud enough for a few others to hear, about a legendary blacksmith named of Josiah Brennan. Folks called him Ash because he could make a forge sing like a choir, built things no one else could. Then his wife and boy were killed in a raid. They say the man just walked away from the smoke and ashes of his life and was never seen again, vanished into the mountains. Marcus's eyes were fixed on Jacob. "That man," he said, his voice full of a strange new respect. "He knows how things are put together, and he knows how to fix them when they are broken." He said nothing more. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving his words to hang in the air, to plant a new story in the minds of the people of Cedar Falls, a story not of a monster, but of a legend broken by tragedy. Later, as the excitement died down, Mr. Henderson approached them. He looked at Jacob, his eyes full of a businessman's calculation. "I saw what you did with that cane, and with this wagon. My blacksmith is getting old. His hands shake. I could use a man like you. 3 days a week. I will pay you well." Jacob looked at Eleanor. This was a crossroads, and he was letting her choose the path. Eleanor met Henderson's gaze. Her chin held high. "We would need to be advanced some supplies on credit," she said, her voice clear and businesslike. "And we live a day's travel from here, in the High Valley. We would work our 3 days, but on our own schedule." Henderson considered for a moment, then nodded. "Deal," he said, sealing it with a handshake offered to Eleanor. As they were loading their newly acquired supplies onto the mule, a small girl of about 6, her eyes wide with a child's unfiltered curiosity, stood watching Jacob. She held a doll with a missing arm, while Eleanor settled the account with Henderson. Jacob sat on a barrel, took out his knife and a small block of pine from his pocket. The little girl watched, mesmerized, as his hands, which had just recently lifted a wagon, now moved with an artist's delicacy. Wood shavings fell to the ground like soft curls as a shape began to emerge. It was a bird, small and perfect, its head cocked as if listening to a song. He sanded it smooth with his calloused thumb and then, without a word, held it out to her. The girl's mother, standing nearby, took a sharp breath, her first instinct to pull her daughter away. But she stopped. She saw the gentleness in the large man's eyes, the beautiful, simple gift offered in his open palm. She saw the way her daughter looked at him, not with fear, but with wonder. A slow, warm smile spread across the mother's face. She nodded to her daughter. The little girl took the wooden bird, her small fingers closing around it. "Thank you," she whispered. It was a small moment, easily missed in the bustle of the day. But to Eleanor, it was everything. It was the sound of a heavy door, locked for a long time, finally creaking open. It was the turning point. The rumors had been loud, but a small act of kindness, a shared moment of humanity, had proven to be louder. Winter did not arrive with a gentle warning. It descended from the high peaks like a predator, a sudden, sharp-toothed wind that stripped the last of the golden leaves from the aspens and left the sky the color of a dull pewter bowl. But inside their small cabin, a pocket of warmth and order had been carved out of the wilderness. The credit from Henderson had been put to good use. They had a floor of rough sawn planks that kept the damp from seeping up from the earth, and a sturdy door Jacob had built from seasoned pine. Fitted with a heavy iron bolt he had forged himself during his first week at the smithy in Cedar Falls. The window opening was covered with a taut layer of canvas, which muted the harsh daylight to a soft, constant glow. It was a small, solid world of their own making. The rhythms of their life had settled into a quiet routine. 3 days a week, they would make the long journey to Cedar Falls, where Jacob would work at the forge, his silence and skill earning him a quiet but solid reputation. The remaining days were spent at the cabin, Jacob hunting or improving the structure, Eleanor cooking, mending, and turning their shelter into a home. They spoke little, but their silence was a shared language of comfortable companionship, a gesture to pass a tool, a look across the fire, the simple act of sharing a meal. All of it built a bond stronger than any vow. The first snow came in the night, a fine, dusting powder. By morning, a thick white blanket covered the valley, muffling all sound, making their world feel even more secluded and private. For a week, the weather held, cold and still. Then the sky darkened, and a wind began to howl down the canyon, a low, mournful sound that grew in intensity until the entire cabin shuddered with its force. The snow began to fall again, not in soft flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain that erased the world beyond their door. They were trapped, but it was a comfortable confinement. A fire roared in the hearth, and the smell of Eleanor's baking bread filled the small space. It was a feeling of profound security, of having built something strong enough to withstand the world's fury. They were 2 days into the storm when the sound came, a frantic, desperate pounding on their new, sturdy door. Jacob rose instantly, his face a mask of caution. No one should be out in this. He took a heavy iron poker from the hearth and stood to the side as he slid the bolt back. The door flew open on a blast of wind and snow, revealing a figure so covered in ice it was barely recognizable as a man. It was Dr. Morrison from Cedar Falls, his face raw and chapped, his eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Behind him, slumped in the saddle of a weary horse, was a woman wrapped in a thick buffalo hide. "For God's sake, man, help me!" the doctor gasped, his words nearly snatched away by the wind. "It is Sarah Winters. Her time has come, and the pass back to town is completely blocked. I saw your smoke. You were the only chance we had." In an instant, their sanctuary became a field hospital. Jacob moved with a swift, decisive strength, lifting the groaning woman from the horse as if she weighed nothing and carrying her inside. Eleanor was already piling their blankets and furs beside the hearth, creating a warm, soft bed. She helped the doctor remove Sarah's frozen outer garments while Jacob saw to the horses, leading them into the small, three-sided lean-to he had built for their mule. Sarah Winters was young, barely a woman herself, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her body racked with the powerful contractions of childbirth. Eleanor's own past, her own quiet sorrows, fell away, replaced by an urgent, focused empathy. She boiled water, tore their cleanest sheets into strips, and spoke to Sarah in a low, calming voice, her presence a steady anchor in the young woman's storm of pain. Jacob returned, shaking the snow from his coat, and for a moment, he stood frozen in the doorway, a look of profound, haunted memory on his face. He seemed to see not Sarah Winters, but another woman, in another time, her cries echoing in a place filled with fire and smoke. Eleanor saw the tremor in his hands, the deep well of pain that had opened in his eyes. He took a step back, as if to flee, but then he caught Eleanor's gaze. She did not look at him with pity, but with a quiet, steady trust. Her look did not ask him to forget his past, but to be present in this moment. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the ghost receded. The craftsman, the rescuer, the man who knew how to fix broken things, took over. His hands, which had been trembling, became firm and sure. He saw Dr. Morrison fumbling with a knot, his fingers numb with cold, and Jacob's knife was there in an instant, severing the cord. He saw Sarah's husband, Tom, who had followed on another horse, pacing uselessly and wringing his hands, and Jacob put a firm hand on his shoulder, leading him to the water bucket, giving him a task, a purpose. He became the doctor's silent, efficient assistant, his movements economical, his instincts unerring. He seemed to know what was needed before he was asked. A clean cloth, more hot water, a steady pressure on Sarah's back. He had the hands of a man who had done this before, in some other, harder life. The storm raged outside, a symphony of chaos, but inside the small cabin, a different, more primal drama unfolded. Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Finally, as the wind outside reached a crescendo, a new sound cut through it all, a thin, piercing wail, the sound of a new life drawing its first breath. "A daughter," the doctor announced, his voice thick with exhaustion and triumph. A healthy baby girl. Tom Winters, the young father, collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with ragged, grateful sobs. Eleanor gently washed the newborn and wrapped her in a soft linen cloth. She held the small, squirming bundle for a moment, her heart filled with a fierce, protective tenderness. The doctor handed the swaddled infant to Jacob. "Take her," he said. "Let her father have a moment." Jacob froze, his hands rising as if to ward her off. A look of sheer terror crossed his face. He shook his head. A single, sharp, negative gesture. But Eleanor was there. She walked to him and placed the baby in his arms. His whole body went rigid. His large, scarred hands, which could bend iron and lift wagons, were clumsy and trembling as they held the impossibly small and fragile life. He stared down at the tiny, wrinkled face, at the small, perfect mouth that opened in a silent yawn, and the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart for years simply crumbled into dust. The memories he held at bay every waking moment came rushing in, a tidal wave of grief, the memory of another small face, another tiny hand clutching his finger. He did not make a sound, but Eleanor saw the tears tracking paths through the grime on his cheeks. He stood there for a long time, the storm inside him every bit as fierce as the one outside. But he did not break. He held the baby with a desperate, gentle strength, his body a shield against all the sorrows of the world. Later, when the new mother was sleeping and the baby was settled in a makeshift bed in a wooden crate, Tom Winters approached Jacob. He was a simple man, a farmer, his words plain and heartfelt. "I saw your face," he said, his voice low. "I do not know your story, but I know what I saw today. You saved them, both of them. When this snow clears, I am coming back. I am going to help you build your workshop. It is the only way I know how to thank you." Jacob simply nodded, his throat too tight for words. That night, the storm finally began to abate. The Winters family slept soundly. The doctor dozed in a chair by the hearth, but Eleanor and Jacob sat on the floor, staring into the glowing embers of the fire. The shared ordeal had left them emotionally raw, their defenses stripped away. The silence was different now, heavy with unspoken things. Eleanor looked at him, at the hard lines of his face softened by the firelight. She saw a long, pale scar on the side of his neck, disappearing into his collar, a mark she had never noticed before. Without thinking, she reached out and gently traced its path with her fingertips. He flinched at her touch, but did not pull away. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his powerful frame. She did not remove her hand. She left it there, a small point of warmth and connection. After a long moment, he turned to her, and she wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a gentle embrace. He resisted for a second. Then he sagged against her, his large body trembling, and he buried his face in her shoulder. They held each other for a long time, two survivors in the quiet aftermath of a storm, breathing in unison. Her small frame a surprising source of strength for his immense sorrow. He spoke, his voice a broken whisper against her ear, the words torn from a place he kept locked away. His name was Daniel. He had his mother's eyes. The fire, I heard them. For so long, I heard them. Eleanor held him tighter, her own tears falling silently into his hair. She did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell him it would be all right. She offered him the only truth she had. "You are here," she whispered. "You are here, with me." In the days that followed, as the snow melted under a bright, cold sun and the valley emerged, clean and new, Jacob began a new project. He chose the best piece of pine from their woodpile, a straight-grained, flawless board. And with his knife and a few simple tools, he began to build a cradle. He worked with a quiet, reverent intensity, his hands moving with a love that was both a memory and a prayer. He sanded the wood until it was as smooth as river stone and carved small, simple birds into the headboard. It was a masterpiece of simple, heartfelt craftsmanship. When it was finished, he placed it in the corner of the cabin. It was empty, a silent testament to a life that had been lost, but in the warm, safe space of their home. It did not feel like a monument to grief. It was a vessel, waiting. It was a promise that their home was now strong enough to hold both the deepest sorrow and the most profound hope. Spring thawed the valley with a gentle, persistent touch. The creek, which had been a frozen ribbon of silence, awoke with a cheerful, gurgling voice, and the high meadows blushed with the pale green of new grass. True to his word, Tom Winters had returned as soon as the passes were clear. He was a man transformed by gratitude, and he put his back into the work with a farmer's tireless strength. Together, he and Jacob raised the walls of the smithy, a small, solid structure of timber and stone a short distance from the cabin. The rhythmic sound of their hammers and saws became the new heartbeat of the valley, a sound of creation and partnership. Life fell into a rhythm of satisfying labor, while the men worked on the smithy. Eleanor planted a small garden with seeds she had bought in Cedar Falls, her hands in the rich, dark earth a constant source of peace. She felt a sense of belonging so profound it was almost a physical presence, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. The ghosts of her past, the sharp edges of her grief for the husband she had lost, and the betrayal of the man who had lured her west, had softened, their voices fading into the quiet hum of her new life. Once a month, if the weather was clear, a lone mail rider made the treacherous journey up from the lower territories, bringing news and letters to the scattered homesteads in the town of Cedar Falls. His arrival was an event, a brief, welcome intrusion from the outside world. One bright afternoon in late May, as Eleanor was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two young pines, she heard the distant jingle of his horse's bell. Jacob and Tom stopped their work, their faces turning toward the sound. The rider, a wiry young man with a sun-bleached mustache, brought them a small sack of mail for the town, but he had one letter that he pulled separately from his pouch. It was addressed in a neat, official hand to a Mrs. Eleanor Whitlow, care of Henderson's Mercantile, Cedar Falls. The name felt foreign on her tongue, a skin she had shed long ago. She took the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. It was from Ohio, from her old life. She thanked the rider, gave him a cool drink from the creek, and waited until he had disappeared back down the trail before she broke the wax seal. She sat on the small bench Jacob had built by the cabin door, the paper crisp and strange in her hands. The letter was from the county sheriff in the town she had once called home. It was concise and professional. A man named Jedediah Finch, the foreman of the logging company where her first husband, Robert, had been arrested in connection with a stagecoach robbery. In the course of the investigation, other facts had come to light, other stories of his recklessness and disregard for the safety of his men. The sheriff was building a larger case against him, and he had uncovered the truth of the accident that had killed Robert, a truth Finch had covered up with bribes and threats. It had been no accident. Finch had ordered the use of a frayed cable, ignoring warnings, in a rush to meet a deadline. Her testimony, as the widow who had been silenced and sent away with a pittance, was required. The trial was in 6 weeks. The world, which had felt so solid and real a moment before, seemed to tilt on its axis. She read the letter again, and then a third time. Justice. It was a word she had given up on. For years, a small, hard knot of unresolved anger had sat in her stomach, a quiet poison. She had been told Robert's death was a tragedy, an act of God. To learn now that it had been a crime, a death caused by one man's greed, was like having an old wound torn open. The conflict that rose in her was a physical torment. To go meant leaving the valley, the cabin, the life she and Jacob had built with their bare hands. It meant a long, arduous journey back to a place that was no longer her home. To face people and memories she had tried to bury. It meant leaving Jacob. The thought of it was a sharp, physical pain. What if something happened while she was gone? What if the fragile magic of their life together could not survive the separation? But not to go felt like a betrayal of Robert's memory, a betrayal of the woman she was becoming, a woman who had stood up to a mob and faced down a man with a rifle. To turn her back on this chance for a final, legal reckoning felt like an act of cowardice, a retreat back into the helpless silence of her past. For 2 days, she was a ghost in her own home. She carried the letter in her apron pocket, its sharp corners a constant reminder. She went through the motions of cooking and mending, but her mind was 1,000 miles away. Jacob watched her, his silent gaze missing nothing. He saw her distraction, the new tension in her shoulders, the way she would stop and stare out at the mountains, her eyes seeing something else entirely. He did not press her. He waited. On the evening of the second day, as they sat by the fire, the silence stretching between them, she finally pulled the letter from her pocket. "It is from Ohio," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She explained its contents, her voice growing stronger and steadier as she gave voice to the injustice. When she was finished, she looked at him, her heart in her eyes, silently pleading for an answer she did not have. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The firelight carved deep shadows into the lines of his face, making him look older. A man acquainted with every form of grief. He had his own ghosts, his own need for a justice the world would never provide. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the need to speak the truth of a wrong that had been done. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes clear and full of a deep, unwavering certainty. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. "You have to go," he said, his voice low and firm. "You have to speak your truth. I will wait." The simple words were a release. He was not holding her back. He was setting her free. Free to be whole. Free to close the final door on her past so that she could fully step into their future. In that moment, her love for him was so overwhelming it left no room for fear. The departure was quiet and bittersweet. Jacob gave her a small deerskin pouch heavy with the silver coins he had earned at the forge. Tom Winters, his face full of concern, promised to look after him. As she settled into the seat of the eastbound stagecoach in Cedar Falls, Jacob pressed a small, smooth river stone into her hand, a piece of the valley, for her to hold on to. He did not kiss her. He simply squeezed her hand, a long, firm pressure that said everything that needed to be said. The journey back east was a strange, dreamlike experience, as the raw, magnificent landscape of the West gave way to the rolling green hills and tidy farms of Ohio. She felt like a traveler in a foreign land. The trial was a quiet, somber affair, held in a stuffy courtroom that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. There was no dramatic victory. She simply stood in the witness box and told her story, her voice clear and without malice. She told the truth about the frayed cable, about Finch's dismissal of her concerns, about the meager sum of money she had been given to ensure her silence. Her testimony, combined with that of others, was enough. Jedediah Finch was found guilty. As the judge handed down the sentence, Eleanor felt not a surge of triumph, but a profound sense of peace. A heavy weight she had carried for years simply lifted and dissolved. A chapter of her life had finally, truly, ended. While she was gone, letters from Jacob began to arrive. Forwarded from the mercantile, they were her lifeline, her anchor to the valley. They were written on scraps of paper in a slow, struggling hand, the spelling often wrong, but the meaning as clear as the mountain water. The first one said simply, "Workshop done, Tom good man." The second arrived a few weeks later. "Made a bell. For new church in Cedar Falls. It rings loud. Sun comes over peak." The third and final letter was the one she held closest to her heart. It came just as she was preparing to leave Ohio. He had written, "Miss Smell of your bread, come home." While she was closing a door on her past, he had been building their future. He and Tom had finished the smithy, fitting it with a forge Jacob had built himself, its bellows made from a supple deer hide. It was a place of power and creation, and Jacob poured all his restless energy into it. The clang of his hammer on steel, a new song in the valley. The church bell was his masterpiece, a gift to the community that was slowly, cautiously, beginning to accept him. Its clear, resonant tone was his voice, speaking for the first time not in anger or sorrow, but in creation. But he had saved his most important work for the cabin, while she was gone. Driven by a vision of her return, he had undertaken a difficult task, with his own hands. He had cut a new opening in the eastern wall, the wall that faced the highest peak of the range. He had carefully framed it and fitted it with a pane of real glass he had bought from Henderson, a costly and extravagant purchase. It was a window positioned perfectly to catch the very first rays of the morning sun as they spilled over the mountain and into their home. It was a practical, solid, beautiful gesture. It was a love letter written in timber and glass. It was his way of saying that he was not just waiting for her. He was preparing a place for her, a home where she would always be able to see the dawn. The final leg of the journey home was the longest. The stagecoach swayed and rattled, climbing steadily back into the high country. And with every mile, Eleanor's heart beat a little faster. The manicured fields of Ohio were a distant, faded memory, replaced once more by the raw, magnificent beauty of the West. This was her landscape now, the sharp peaks and endless sky, the scent of pine and dust. This was home. When the coach finally pulled into Cedar Falls, she was the only passenger to disembark. She scanned the busy street, her eyes searching the crowd of miners, trappers, and townsfolk. And then she saw him. He was standing by the mercantile, holding the lid rope of their old, stubborn mule. He was not looking at the stagecoach, but down the trail, as if he had been watching the horizon for her all morning. He had trimmed his beard, and his dark hair was tied back with a leather thong. He wore a clean shirt. He looked solid and real, and so achingly familiar it made her breath catch in her throat. He saw her then, and the world seemed to fall away. The noise of the street, the shouts of the drivers, the clang of a distant hammer, all of it faded into a dull hum. He did not smile, but a light came into his eyes, a warmth that traveled across the dusty space between them and enveloped her completely. He dropped the mule's rope and started toward her, his long strides eating up the ground. Eleanor met him halfway, her carpet bag falling forgotten to the ground. They stopped a foot apart, the air crackling with everything they had not said, everything they had felt during the long weeks of their separation. He simply stood there, his gaze taking in every detail of her face, as if to reassure himself that she was truly real. Then he opened his arms, and she stepped into them. The embrace was not gentle. It was a collision of relief and longing, a desperate, grounding act. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her so tight she could feel the frantic, steady beat of his heart against her own. She buried her face in the rough cloth of his shirt, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke, iron, and him. It was the scent of home. He said nothing, simply held her, his large hand stroking her hair, his body a solid, unshakable shield against the world. It was an embrace that said, "You are back. You are safe. I am here." The journey back to the valley was made in a comfortable, contented silence. The mule, laden with the few supplies Eleanor had brought back, plodded along, and they walked beside it, their shoulders occasionally brushing. They were reacquainting themselves with the simple, profound pleasure of just being together. When they finally rounded the last bend and the valley opened up before them, green and peaceful in the late afternoon sun, Eleanor let out a soft sigh of pure happiness. She saw the new smithy, solid and permanent, and then her gaze fell upon the cabin. She saw the new window, a single, clear eye catching the golden light, and her heart swelled. That night, after a simple meal of stew and fresh bread, they sat before the fire. The cabin was warm and filled with a sense of peace so deep it felt sacred. Jacob had been quiet all evening, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was full, not empty, charged with a nervous, tender energy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped object, his hands, which could tame wild horses and shape unyielding steel, fumbled slightly with the knot. He finally unwrapped it and held it out to her on his open palm. It was a ring, but it was unlike any ring Eleanor had ever seen. It was not a simple band, but 3 thin strands of metal, braided together with incredible skill. One strand was the dark, textured gray of forged iron, another had the warm, reddish glow of copper, and the third shone with the soft, white light of silver. The 3 metals, so different in nature, were woven into a single, beautiful, unbreakable whole. "It is not gold," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble, "but it is strong, like us." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she took it from his palm. It was heavier than it looked, solid and real. She slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. It was a piece of him, of his work, of his soul. It was a ring made of the very elements of their life, the hard iron of survival, the warmth of the copper hearth, the hopeful gleam of a silver moon. She looked at him, her heart too full for words. "I love it," she whispered. Now it was her turn. Before leaving Ohio, she had taken the last of her money and had gone to a jeweler. She had bought a simple, plain gold band. She reached into her reticule and pulled out the small box. She took his left hand, turning it over. She looked at the calluses, the scars, the ingrained evidence of his hard life. She remembered that day in the dusty square in Dustwater, holding up a ring that had been too small, a symbol of a life that did not fit, a desperate gamble in the face of death. This was not a gamble. This was a choice. She took the new ring from the box and slid it onto his finger. It fit perfectly, settling into place as if it had been made for him. "This one fits," she said softly, her eyes holding his. He looked down at the gleaming gold against his scarred skin, then back up at her, his expression one of awe and profound, heart-rending gratitude. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. Eleanor reached up and gently wiped it away with her thumb. She leaned forward, and this time, she was the one who initiated the kiss. It was soft and searching, a question and an answer all at once. When they broke apart, the air in the small cabin was thick with an emotion that had been building since the day they had met. "I love you, Jacob," she said, the words as simple and true as the firelight. He closed his eyes, as if the words were a physical blow. He brought his hand up, the one with the new gold ring, and cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I love you, Eleanor," he answered, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken feeling. It was a threshold, a door opening into a new, unexplored room of their life together. The bond of survival, of partnership, of deep affection finally flowered into this, the last of their reservations. The final ghosts of their pasts seemed to burn away in the heat of their shared confession. What followed was not a torrent of passion, but a quiet, reverent exploration. His hands, those calloused, powerful hands of a blacksmith, were impossibly gentle as they touched her, as if he were handling the most fragile and precious thing he had ever known. The deep, ingrained trust they had built through shared labor and silent understanding now found a new language. Every touch was a question, every soft sigh an answer. The wind moaned outside the cabin, a lonely sound from the vast wilderness. But inside their small, warm world, there was only the sound of their soft breathing, a rhythm that slowly, surely fell into a single, shared cadence. For two people who had known so much loss and pain, this union was not about taking, but about giving. It was a quiet, sacred offering of the deepest, most vulnerable parts of themselves, a healing of wounds they had both thought would never close. A few days later, as Eleanor was tending her garden in the bright morning sun, a familiar, silent figure appeared at the edge of the valley. It was Tava. He approached the cabin, his movements as fluid and silent as a shadow. Jacob came out of the smithy, wiping his hands on a rag, and greeted him with a nod of deep respect. Tava did not speak at first. He simply looked from Jacob to Eleanor, his dark, intelligent eyes taking in the new ease between them, the new light in their faces. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. He held out a gift. It was a simple cord, braided from different colored strands of dyed yucca fiber and sinew. It was intricately woven, strong and beautiful. "Each thread is a memory," Tava said, his English simple and profound. "The sorrows, the hard journeys, the small kindnesses. You do not discard them. You weave them together. They make the cord strong." He placed the cord in Eleanor's hands, then closed Jacob's hand over hers. It was a blessing, a recognition of their union from the spirit of the land itself. Theirs had not been a marriage made in a church or by a contract. It had been forged in a cage, tested in a canyon, and now, finally, woven into a bond as strong and resilient as the ancient mountains that held their home. The summer settled into the high valley, a season of long, sunlit days and cool, star-filled nights. The work of survival gave way to the rhythm of living. In Cedar Falls, the day finally came to hang the bell. It was a community event, a holiday declared by common consent. The small, unpainted church, which had stood silent for a year, was finally being given its voice. Jacob stood at the back of the crowd, Eleanor beside him, their hands linked. He did not watch the men hoisting the heavy bronze bell he had forged into the new belfry. He watched the faces of the people. He saw Tom and Sarah Winters, their baby daughter Hope cradled in Sarah's arms. He saw Mr. Henderson from the mercantile, who gave him a respectful nod. He saw the mother of the little girl to whom he had given the carved bird, and she smiled at him. He was no longer the monster from the cage, nor even just the blacksmith. He was a part of this place. When the bell was finally secured, the minister invited Jacob to be the first to ring it. He shook his head, a slight, firm gesture. He had made the bell, but its voice belonged to the town. The minister understood. He pulled the thick rope, and a sound rolled out across the valley. A single, clear, resonant note that was both powerful and beautiful. It was a sound of community, of hope, of a future being built together. It was Jacob's voice, finally speaking to them all. They were preparing to leave when a rider galloped into town, his horse lathered and heaving. He brought urgent news. A large freight caravan, carrying winter supplies and the payroll for the new mine, was a half-day out, making its way through the lower canyons. A band of rustlers, wanted men from the territories, had been spotted setting up an ambush in the narrow pass known as the Devil's Jaw. A wave of fear and indecision rippled through the crowd. The caravan was their lifeline. To lose it would mean a hard, hungry winter for everyone. Sheriff Caro, looking pale and overwhelmed, began to talk about organizing a posse, but his words lacked conviction. It was a known gang, ruthless and well-armed. A direct assault would be a slaughter. That evening, back in the quiet of their own valley, the problem was laid out before their small fire. Tom Winters was there, his face grim. Tava had appeared as the sun was setting, having heard the news on the wind of the mountains. Jacob did not speak of fighting. He took a piece of charcoal and began to sketch the Devil's Jaw in the dirt, his knowledge of the terrain absolute. He drew the narrow entrance, the high, sheer walls, the sharp turn at the far end. It was a perfect trap. He explained, his words sparse but clear, that a trap could be sprung both ways. Eleanor listened, her mind working. She spoke of the heavy coils of rope in Henderson's store, the thickest kind, used for logging. Tom, his farmer's mind practical, talked about the wild horses that roam the high meadows, how easily they spooked. Tava, his voice low, described a dry gully that ran parallel to the main canyon, a hidden path that would allow them to get ahead of the bandits undetected. A plan began to form, not of bullets and bloodshed, but of strategy and terrain, a plan woven from the skills of everyone present. They rode under the light of a half-moon, a small, determined company. They did not look like a war party. They were a blacksmith, a farmer, a native hunter, and a woman who had learned that her quiet strength was a weapon all its own. They used the gully Tava had described, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth. They reached the Devil's Jaw well before dawn and set to work. Jacob and Tom, their muscles straining in the darkness, stretched the thick logging ropes across the narrowest part of the canyon, anchoring them to heavy boulders and concealing them with dust and brush. They were set at the height of a horse's chest, invisible in the deep shadows. Eleanor worked with Tava, gathering piles of loose shale and rock at the top of the canyon walls, creating small, unstable slides that could be triggered with a single, well-aimed push. It was a quiet, deadly preparation. They were in position as the first light of dawn touched the highest peaks. They heard the bandits long before they saw them, the sound of rough laughter and the clink of whiskey bottles echoing in the still air. There were 7 of them, hard-faced men with rifles held easy in their hands. They rode into the pass with an arrogant confidence. From his vantage point high above, Jacob gave a low whistle, the signal. Tom and Tava, hidden in the rocks near the entrance, let out a series of piercing cries that mimicked the scream of a mountain lion, while at the same time releasing the small herd of wild horses they had driven into the gully. The terrified animals, their eyes wide with panic, stampeded into the mouth of the canyon, a wave of chaos and thundering hooves. The bandits' horses reared and plunged before the men could regain control. The stampede was upon them. At the same moment, Jacob and Eleanor sent the rock slides crashing down. The noise was deafening. A roar of falling stone and screaming horses. The bandits were thrown into complete disarray. 2 of them were unseated immediately, their own horses bolting. The others fought to control their panicked mounts, only to ride headlong into the thick, invisible ropes. The effect was devastating. Horses and riders went down in a tangled, screaming heap. The ambush was broken, the attackers disarmed and disoriented in a matter of seconds. It was then that a new rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. It was Marcus Garrett. He sat on his horse, a rifle held across his lap, taking in the scene of chaos. He saw Jacob and the others emerge from their hiding places. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The captured bandits, struggling to their feet, saw him as a potential savior. One of them recognized him. He called out for Marcus to help them, to open fire on the settlers. Marcus looked at the trapped men, then at Jacob. He saw the women and children of the caravan, which had now come into view at the far end of the pass, their faces pale with fear. The war inside him, the long battle between vengeance and community, was finally over. He raised his rifle, and he pointed it not at Jacob, but squarely at the bandits. He told them that their ride was over. His voice was firm, the voice of a man who had finally chosen his side. His redemption was complete. By the time Sheriff Caro and his hastily assembled posse arrived, the fight was finished. They found 7 bruised and humbled bandits, their hands tied, guarded by a blacksmith, a farmer, a hunter, a woman, and the brother of the man they had once accused of murder. Caro, his face a mixture of awe and embarrassment, finally did his duty. He took the prisoners into custody, his voice full of a new, hard-won authority. He informed them that Judge O'Rourke would be presiding over their trial. The law, slow and sometimes weak, had finally arrived. The sun was just beginning to rise as they returned to their own valley. The air was cool and clean, washed new by the events of the night. Eleanor sat at the spinning wheel Jacob had made for her, its gentle, rhythmic hum a song of peace. Through the new eastern window, the first rays of dawn spilled into the cabin, a river of golden light that fell across the floor and touched the empty cradle in the corner. The cradle was still there, a beautiful, silent presence. But its meaning had changed. It was no longer a symbol of what was lost or what was missing. It was simply a part of their home, a home that was now so full, so strong, that its happiness did not depend on what might fill the empty spaces. Sarah and Tom's daughter, baby Hope, now a toddling child of nearly 1 year, had taken her first shaky steps on their porch just last week, her small hand clutching Jacob's finger. Their home was already overflowing with life. The first sunbeam touched Jacob's face as he stood in the open doorway, looking out at the mountains, his mountains. He was a man who had been hollowed out by grief and silenced by injustice. He had been caged like an animal and hunted like a monster, but he had endured. He had built. He had loved. They called him a legend. To Eleanor, he was her husband, and the West, finally, was home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from in the world to connect with everyone. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.